All right, welcome to the next section. So we're actually going to go ahead and start using Bolt to create some interactivity. So to start with, right, we've already set up we've created the flow machine component, which created a variables component. We've gone to the window menu at the top of the screen and we've pulled down and created our graph inspector, and variables windows. So we have these panes set up all throughout this. Now, if you are tuning into this tutorial and you haven't watched the previous one where we install and set up Bolt, you should probably go and watch the previous one where that happens, because otherwise you're going to be very confused and lost. All right, so when you start and you create your new graph, right, we created this macro and we added it and named it. What happens is you get this, by default, you get this start event and the update event. And what these two things mean is these are exact replicas of, if we were to do this scripting with a text editor, you would have what's called the start function and the update function. And they are events, but they're, and so what that means is whenever the program starts, whenever you hit play up here, any object that has one of these start events attached to it, anything that is going to have anything attached to that start event will be triggered to happen, right? And so this little green arrow just means there's a trigger, like a pulse comes out of here, and they actually animate that as a way to show what's happening and how the flow's happening, and then it helps you debug it, right? The update event is an event where each time, so in video games, in video, anytime there's moving images on screen, you have something called frame rate, right? You have which is basically a static image. Each frame's a static image, and the number of frames per second, so usually for video it's 30 or 60, sometimes 120. For video games it varies widely, but each one of those frames, each time that updates, is essentially drawing a different picture to the screen, and that's how we get that sense of things being animated. But there's a lot of other things that are happening, underneath that image being drawn, and that's what the update event does. Is it triggers those other things to happen, or checks for other things as well. Okay. So, however, these events, which are triggers, right? They trigger things to happen. We're not going to use either of these. And so to get rid of a unit, we can click and drag off in space somewhere, select both of these, and we can right click on it, and we can just go down to delete selection, right? So those units are gone. The event that we want, right, what we're going to be doing, eventually what we want to do is we want this ball to come down the ramp, and rather than just knocking these dominoes over, we want it to essentially destroy those dominoes. We want the dominoes to disappear as they're hit by this other object. But that is going to be a bit more of a complex script. And so we're going to start with something simpler just to show kind of the flow and the workflow and the way that this works. And what we're going to do is we're going to make it so that as this ball is rolling down the ramp or doing whatever, if we hit the space bar, it will jump up in the air, right? And then it'll fall back down. And so that's what we're going to do. So we're going to start by creating a keyboard event. And most events are titled, it's like on keyboard event or on collider or on this or on etc. So what we're going to do to create a new unit in here is you right click and then you just type in the start of what you want. In this case it's on keyboard. So if I just type on key as one block of characters, you'll notice that the very first option is on keyboard input, which is exactly what we want. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that. It's going to create this new one, and we're just going to leave it set to the default, right? And I just want to, I'm going to see if I can zoom in any further. Nope. Whoop. Here we go. Okay, so I'm going to hold down Control and zoom this way. There we go. All right, so there's a few things about this. First, this green color means that it's an event or a trigger. Anything that's on the left-hand side, these are inputs for this. So I could potentially have something else over here that changes what key I'm using or changes what type of action. Currently, the key is set to the space bar. If I click on this, you'll see there's a whole bunch of other options here. It's basically every key on the keyboard. So I could adjust that if I wanted to. And this action down means when the key is pressed down is when it's going to be triggered, right? The other options are hold, so while the key is down, or up. So basically, if the key's been pressed down and I release it, then it would trigger at that point. And in our case, we want it to be down. On this other side, these are the outputs. And the only output for this is this green arrow. The green arrow indicates a trigger or a pulse that goes out to trigger other things. They call it the flow. All right, and so all we have out is flow, right? Which is basically like a, hey, the key was hit, is what it's telling the software. And the simplest way to do this is what we need to do is we need to, you might think like, oh yeah, we'll just, adjust what we want to do is adjust the position of this. But really, what's controlling the way that this object is moving right now is this rigid body tag, right? Remember, that's what tells Unity, if we create a rigid body component, it tells Unity we want physics to be working on this object. And if physics is working on this object, that's what's controlling the position and rotation of this object is the rigid body, right? And specifically, the thing that we're going to want to adjust is by default not visible up here, right? There's all of these options down here, and these are all things called variables, and we'll talk about that more in just a little bit. But what we want to do is if you have your rigid body open and you go and you click on info, you'll see that there's a bunch of these grayed out things. Now these are parameters or variables that you can't, you don't access here necessarily, but we can access them through code and through this visual scripting setup that Bolt has. And so the thing we want to adjust is velocity, right? And so velocity is essentially, how fast is this object moving in all three axes at any given moment, right? And so, typically the velocity for y, right, it's going to be negative until it hits some solid object, and then it'll be 0, or maybe it'll hover around 0. And what we want to do is we want to inject, in order to make this jump, we want to inject a positive value here that makes it launch up off the ground until gravity slowly pulls it back down. And so what we're going to do is we're going to set this y value to, we'll say 10 to start with. And so we're going to set it to 10, and then each frame after that, gravity is going to have an effect on it. So we'll set the velocity to 10, so it's going to launch up, but then that velocity is going to get smaller and smaller, and eventually it'll turn negative again as gravity makes it fall back towards the ground. And we're not going to do anything with the x or the z values at this point. And we're actually going to we're going to break it for a second so you can see some of the issues. But to start with, let's just go ahead and create one more unit. We're going to right click and either click add unit, or if nothing's selected, just create a new unit. And then the unit that we need is, we've been talking about this, right? It's rigid body. And the thing from rigid body we very specifically need is velocity. And so the way that all of this works is every one of these objects, whether it's sphere collider or rigid body or mesh renderer, or transform, if you want to access one of these other things that's within here that's named, what you do is you say rigid body dot mass, or rigid body dot drag, or rigid body dot use gravity, or say rigid body dot velocity, and that's how you access the velocity member of this component called rigid body. Right? And so what I can do is I can come over here in my search and I can type in rigid body. And once I type in rigid body, if I click on it, you'll see that there's just a ton of different things that I can do, right? And I'm not worried about all of those at all right now. In fact, there's one specific one I want. And so I'm going to type in rigid body, the full word, and then dot, and then VE. And if I do that, you'll see that it reduces the number of options that I have. It's giving me this rigid body 2D, which, right, we don't have. This is a 3D rigid body. So we don't want the 2D ones. What we want is this rigid body dot velocity. And we don't want to get the velocity. We want to set the velocity, right? And so typically there's two different types of things, one that gets and one that sets, right? So it may be useful for us to grab whatever the current velocity of this is to use for something else. But in our case, we actually want to set the velocity. So I'm going to click on rigid body dot velocity set. Now, once I've done that, it's created this, and you can see there's 3 potential inputs here and 2 outputs. And we're actually not going to use any of the outputs because all we want to do is set this velocity, right? We don't want to do anything further with it after that. So the first thing we need to do is we need to make sure we connect the flow, right? So the flow is going to come in here, right? And so now our keyboard input is going to control our rigid body. Now the next thing we need to do is we need to be able to adjust the y value of the velocity. And so you'll see down here this little icon here, and you'll see this is the arrow, the flow arrow. This little icon is the same as the rigid body icon, which is up here. This means that we could potentially have a rigid body. We could be doing something, setting a value of some other rigid body, right? Something that's not part of the sphere. It could be, you know, a domino's rigid body or something like that. But where it says self in here, that means it is the rigid body for the object we're working with, which in this case is our sphere, which will be our player. So we don't need to do anything there. That can be left unconnected. This next one down here is, you'll see it's got the 3 axes on it. What this is this is called a vector 3. A vector 3 is a type of variable that we're going to use all the time because a vector 3 holds 3 decimal values in it, right? And so you'll notice if we look back to our components, position, rotation, scale up here, each one of those has 3 values. So each one of these is a vector 3 that can hold a decimal value from negative infinity to positive infinity, right? And if we go down, you'll see a few of these just have 1 value. Those are most likely what are called floats or floating point values, which is the same thing as what this x is, what this y is, and what this z is, right? So a vector 3 can hold 3 floating point values. A vector 2 can hold 2 floating point values, right? And you'll notice that velocity also, you know, has 3 values, as do all of these other options down here, except speed. So, right, so it's a very common way to do it. Now, the simplest way to get this to work is just to hard code it. And by hard code it, I mean we can just take this center value here, because if you look here, it's x, y, z, and that is x, y, and z here as well. So I can change that center 0 from 0 to, let's just say 10. That's greater than gravity, so it should lift us off the ground a little bit. And this is all I need to do this as simply as possible. We're going to expand it here in a little bit just to show more complexity, but let's at least see if this functions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and hit the play arrow. And it's going to take a second to update. This will go black for a little bit, and then it'll pop back up. And now if I hit the space bar, it jumps straight up in the air. And I can actually hit the space bar again and again, and it jumps a little bit higher and higher, right? And then it goes through and still knocks those things over, and then it flies off the screen and drops into infinity, right? So I'm going to go ahead and stop that. So this works really well the way it is, but it's pretty limited. And the better way to do this, because it exposes this value that we can adjust somewhere, is to create a new variable, which, let me hide that one because I created it and forgot to delete it, is to create a new variable to set this center value, because then we could have this flow graph closed and we could be like, oh, actually I need this to be 20 or 15 or 12.3 or whatever, right? I want the strength to be something different. And so we're going to create a variable that holds the center, whatever we want the center value to be, and it's actually going to feed that into this, and so it'll change that. So to start with, we need to create a new variable name. So I have my variables option up here. I'm going to click in this dead space that says new variable name, and I'm going to call it jump strength. And I want you to, I'm going to zoom in so you can actually see this pretty easily. So I'm going to type in JUMP, and then no spaces. Spaces are not allowed in variable names. And I'm going to type in STRENGHT, right, which is jump strength. And you'll notice that I have this, the second word of jump strength is capitalized, and that's called internal capitalization. It's a very common thing to do when you name a variable or something with multiple words. Another thing you cannot do with variable names is you cannot have them start with a basically, you should always have them start with a lowercase letter, right? Don't worry about doing anything else other than just a lowercase letter to start with. Once I've typed that name out, I need to click the plus button to create it. And by default, mine says float, but it should say null. Oops. And it's probably because I already created this, let me try this again, once, that it's telling me that it's a float, right? Yours should just have this and it should say null. But all you do is you click on this arrow and the very first option you're going to get is float. So you go ahead and click float, and then we just need to give it a value. And to start with, I'm going to keep it at 10. So I'm just going to give it that value. And then what I need to do is I need to bring this down into my graph. And to do that, I just click on the two little lines over here and drag it down. And I get this. Now you'll notice it has one input and one output. The input basically means I could have some other thing in here that's actually updating this value. Like imagine if this was, instead of this variable being jump strength, maybe this was score. And each time I hit one of these dominoes, I got a point, right? So the code would actually be, adding 1 to my score. And so that's where this input would come in, right? If this was 0 to start with and then I hit 1, it would become 1 and then 2 and then 3, etc. But all we're worried about at this point is the output. We want this to be output to our rigid body. Now I'm going to go ahead and connect this to here. And I want you to note that it's allowing me to do this and it doesn't give me any errors whatsoever. However, as soon as I hit play and hit the jump button, which I'm going to wait for. Okay, so I hit the jump button and nothing happens except this turns red. What that means is that there is some problem here, right? This stuff is working fine, but when it gets to this point, it's problematic. And the reason there's a problem there is because it's I'm sending this value of 10 in here when it's expecting 3 different values, right? All in there at the same time. And so what I need to do is I need to fix that. And there's another object I'm going to need to create, another unit, in order to make that happen. So let me go ahead and zoom in a little bit so we can see this easier. So the first thing is, now that I've got this wire connected, I want to disconnect it because I don't need it there. So you'd think I might be able to click here and drag to get it off of there, but instead it just creates another wire, and then if I let go, it actually even pops up this fuzzy menu, which is not helpful. So if I hit the escape key, that gets rid of that, and if I hit the escape key again, it gets rid of that extra wire that's just floating there. The way that you get rid of, disconnect a wire, which it took me forever to figure out how to do this, is you hover over one of the ends of the wire, it doesn't matter which, and then you just right click and it'll disappear, right? So I've gotten rid of that, but what I need to do is I need to make this variable appropriate to here. And so what I need to do is I actually need to create a vector 3 that I can inject this value just into this center slot, right? So I just want to be able to change the y value without changing the x and z, and then funnel all 3 of those into my velocity. And so to do that, I'm going to right click. I'm going to either go to add unit or this fuzzy menu will pop up. And so I know I need to create a vector 3, right? So I'm going to go ahead and type in VECT, and that will get me close enough, right? I've got a vector 3, I actually have vector 4s and vector 2s. And then there's this new vector 3 here. What I want to do is because I basically need to create a vector 3 variable, and then I need to send it into the vector 3 variable that is velocity that already exists, right? I need to set velocity with this other new vector 3. So you'd think I'd want to go to new vector 3 with this opening and closing parentheses. This is not correct. What I want to do is I want to use this new vector 3 with the x, y, and z. And I'm going to actually create both of them so you can see what the difference is. So I'm going to say new vector 3. I'm going to right click. I'm going to say add unit. I'm going to type in vect again. and then I'm going to go new vector 3 xyz. So the difference here is this creates essentially an empty new vector 3 thing. It creates a place that then I could take another step and then essentially set this. So if I wanted to use this, I'd actually have to create another unit that is the vector 3 set new x, y, and z. And so I'd have to feed this into this one and then adjust the x, y, and z values. But this this vector 3 new here already has those inputs for me. So it takes those two steps and just mushes it into one. So in our case, this is a great option. So I'm going to take this one, I'm going to delete it, I'm going to use this one. And we know that we want the y value to be jump strength. So I'm going to go ahead and click on here. I'm just going to drag this right to this y value. And you'll notice that that disappears that 0. That means that this is attached. And you'll also see that I have this flow arrow. And I have, so I have these two different outputs. So first, what I need is I need this keyboard input to come in here because since this is new, it's being created. And so it needs a trigger in order to be created. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to drop this flow in here. And you'll notice that this line disappears from here, right? And so what I need to do now is connect this the rest of the way. And then all I need to do is take this and attach it, right? Take my vector 3 that I've created and send it on over to my rigid body velocity, right? And so this is my entire script, right? So I've got my keyboard input, I've got my variable. Keyboard input creates this new thing, makes sure that jump strength is the y value, then it sends that out here, and it also triggers this to update. So let's see how this works. So I'm going to hit play. And it's going to drop. And now I can jump and jump. It works exactly the same as it did before, right? And the only difference is now I can come over here to my variables, and if I make that 20 and then click on my game window and hit space, you'll see that now I can jump much higher, right? So I can make this value different. Now something to note, I was trying to work quickly because this was about to fly off the screen. If I come over here and adjust this value and then try to hit the space bar again, you'll see that no matter where I am, I'm not getting anything. I have to click in the game pane. Once I click in the game pane, then you can see all of these things. And so I want you to note that it also tells me here what, let me zoom in, and it doesn't really matter what's going on elsewhere, but here it tells me what the value currently is of this variable, right? It's a really nice thing, so I know that this is a 30. It also shows me the output here. It shows me that this is 0, 30, 0, which is exactly what I want it to be. And then the other thing is when I hit space, right, or whenever this trigger is triggered, you'll see that little ball runs through the flow, and it also runs through here and runs out there. So it gives you a really simple way to like make sure like, oh, I got this right, or this is flowing to the right place, or oops, I forgot, you know. It gives you a pretty easy way to debug what's happening. Okay, so one last thing, and then we will be done with this tutorial, and we'll do a more complex thing in the next tutorial. So the last thing is grouping. As you build more and more complex actions, right, this is just what we need for jumping. Now, if we want to be able to move right and left, we're going to need a lot more code in here, a lot more units. And, you know, maybe there's some other thing where we can pick up certain objects or use other objects, or, you know, who knows what else we need. But you can imagine that pretty quickly there's a lot of stuff going on. And we can actually have multiple graphs as well that break some of that up. But, you know, the big thing is it can get really messy really quick. So grouping is a really nice way to keep things organized. If I hover my mouse kind of off over here somewhere, like you imagine, like if I just click and drag, right, I can select all those objects, right? But if I hold down Control in Windows or Command on the Mac and click and drag, it will actually create this little blue box, which I'm going to try and snug as close to these edges as possible, and it just says group on it. And then over here in the graph inspector, it says group, and there's a comment here, and there's a color, right? So I'm going to just say, I'm going to change this to jump. I could change the color, I don't know, to red, sure, right? Again, just that's organizational. It doesn't do anything. It just makes it pretty. And what's nice about this now is if I click on the little header here, it moves all of these things together, right? So all of this stays together, and I've got this really nicely organized. Now, there's some other things you can do you can create what's called a super unit, where it basically takes you select all of your units and you merge them together, and they become just one unit with with whatever outputs are there and whatever inputs are on the other side, right? And so it merges that together and shrinks it down. We'll look at that in a future tutorial, but for now we've got this set. Now the other nice thing is with all of this is if you've done this and it's weeks later and you're like, oh, I need to build a little set of units that does the jump, and you can open this up and you can read this and be like, oh yeah, this is the part that did jump, and you can ignore anything else that we end up putting in here. Okay, in the next tutorial we will go further forward, and we will make it so that these disappear each time our sphere hits one of them. And maybe we'll increase the scale of our object as well when we do that. Okay, see you next time.